That's bad.
Odds on to become one.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. If you can just check that you're on mute, that would be brilliant. I know that in the emails and messages that I sent out, I did say that this will be recorded. I'm hoping that you're all okay with that because I've not had any messages to say that you're not. But if you're not okay, just turn your camera off and then hopefully you'll go off of the screen. So this session is basically primarily focused on IN scholarships and bar scholarships. What that means is that the Inns of Court, there's 4 of them, and they give scholarships for all sorts of things, not just bar scholarships. So if you're looking for a GDL scholarship or something like that, this is not really the right place, but some of the stuff that you'll learn is transferable across all of the scholarships that the Inns do anyway. A warm welcome, and I'm very grateful that we've managed to get 4 excellent panelists for you that are going to give you some advice on the process and on give you some tips and tricks for how to succeed in obtaining a scholarship from one of the Inns of Courts to do your bar scholarship. We've got Altamish, who is a Middle Temple scholar, Amrit, who's a Lincoln's Inn scholar, Marianne, who's a Gray's Inn scholar, and Emily, who is an Inner Temple scholar. And they will be talking to you very shortly. But just before we kick off and they introduce themselves and give you some information about the inns that they applied to, there was just a little bit of general information that I wanted to give to you all. So depending on what stage you're at, if you are looking to start the bar course in 2024, you should be applying for a scholarship this year. And the deadline is the 3rd of November for all inns. The time differs slightly, but the date is the same. All of the inns offer between about 1.4 million and 1.8 million pounds worth of scholarships each year. So you absolutely should definitely apply, even if you think, oh, well, somebody like me won't get a scholarship. You might just surprise yourself. In terms of the criteria then that they're looking for at the inns, it's actually the same across all of the inns, and that's why I just wanted to mention it at the outset. They're looking for academic performance. Generally speaking, they're looking for a 2-1, they say, unless you've got extenuating circumstances. And if you have got extenuating circumstances for why that is the case, then you should definitely put that on your applications. They then also look at advocacy potential. They're not looking for you to be a barrister right now. They're just looking for potential. And the ways that they look at that is to look at your experience. So do you have any sort of advocacy experience, whether legal or otherwise? The third criteria is legal comprehension and reasoning skills. Are you able to put forward a reasoned argument, and have you got any evidence of that? So the 4th is interpersonal skills. Lots of people do restaurant work and work in shops and things like that. You're meeting different types of people all the time. Again, that's something that you can demonstrate quite easily, even if you've not got a lot of legal experience. They're also looking for motivation to the bar. That doesn't have to be by mini pupilages as such, but that's a good way of demonstrating it. They want to know, why do you want to be a barrister as opposed to doing any other job in the world? That's generally the criteria across all of the inns. So no matter which inn you're thinking of applying to, you need to hit each of those criteria within your application and within your interviews. Like I said a few minutes ago, as I know there's a few people have just joined recently, the deadline is the 3rd of November. So you have to submit your written application by the 3rd of November. And the interviews will be around March or April 2024. There's 2 final things that I just wanted to mention. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that you should not, in my view, join an inn until you know whether or not you've got a scholarship. There's no burden on you to apply to an inn before that, and you don't get extra brownie points for being a member of an inn before you apply for a scholarship. The reason why I say that's important is because you can only apply to one in per year. So for example, suppose you decide, okay, I'm going to apply to Lincoln's Inn this year, but then you go through the process at Lincoln's Inn and you think, oh, I really didn't like that. I'd sooner apply to a different inn next year. If you've become a member of that inn this year and you're unsuccessful in obtaining a scholarship and want to move to a different inn, it can cause a bit of difficulty for you. So you don't have to become a member until I think it's May 2024 if you're applying this year. And you will know whether or not you've got a scholarship by then. So please, 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 if you're going to become a member of an inn before May 2024, just make sure you're very secure and sure in your viewpoint that you want to be a member of that inn. The second thing that I just wanted to note is that the inns have slightly different processes. So I'm sure the scholars will come on to talk about this, but something to note of importance is that Gray's Inn and Lincoln's Inn, they have a paper sift. That means that based on the strength of your written application, they will knock out a certain number of people. It's usually say, I don't know, suppose 350 apply to each inn each year. They will knock out about 100 at that first stage. Whereas Middle Temple and Inner Temple pretty much interview every single person that applies. So if, for example, your written application is not as strong now as you would like it to be, but you're hoping to get more experience before your interviews in March or April 2024, then Inner Temple or Middle Temple may be the way to go, because you will definitely get an interview. Whereas if you apply to Gray's or Lincoln's Inn, you may well be knocked out by the paper sift. That's the general information that I wanted to give you. Victoria, you're popping up because you're not on mute. Can you please mute yourself if that's okay? And then what we're going to do now is move on to the scholars. They're going to speak about each of their inns. If you've got any questions as we go along, then please pop them in the chat, and they will either be answered as we go along, or they will be answered at the end when we have a bit of a Q&A session. Without further ado then, if I'll just introduce Altamash if he's still there.
I am still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. We can.
Great. So, should I just start off?
Yes, please, if you want to introduce yourself and give your tips, and then if there's more information that I think we could try and elicit as we go along, I'll probably ask you some questions as well, if that's all right.
Of course, yeah. So, my name's Altamash, as you just heard, and I received the HR Light Major Scholarship from Middle Temple. The scholarships are a little bit strange. Like, the names don't really mean that much, because no one's gonna if you say to me, "Oh, what scholarship did you receive?" and I say HR Light, no one's gonna know who that is. Like, I've still been trying to track down who HR Light is, but I can't find them. But the first thing I'd say about why I chose Middle Temple. So let me just be unbiased for a second. If I'm being biased, I'll definitely say go for Middle Temple, and I'm sure everyone else will. But if I'm looking at it in an unbiased manner, right, you've got to choose the inn that you feel most comfortable in the application process. So, for example, I had a friend that was at Inner Temple. I really wanted to be Inner Temple because I liked their past, their history, basically. But I spoke to a friend who received a scholarship, and I didn't like their interview process. And I didn't like any of the other interview process. I just felt that Middle Temple's interview process was the best for me. And one more thing, I just want to flag this up while I'm here. If you're doing a part-time course, in your first year of your part-time course, you won't be able to get a scholarship for
I can see
Middle
the
Temple.
like in case of attendance.
Oh, so
can you mute yourself, whoever's just come in?
Sorry. So I was just going to say, if you're in your if you're doing it part-time, you won't get a scholarship in the middle of your second year for Middle Temple. There are 2 inns that you can apply in the middle of your year and you could get a scholarship. I don't know which they are. I know Middle Temple is one of them that doesn't give you one, but I'm sure the others will enlighten you on that. So Middle Temple scholarship actual process is you know, their interview process was the best for me. So I know I'm not supposed to talk about interviews, but look into it yourself and you'll find out why. But the other thing is, yeah, so apart from that, all the inns, they have the same function essentially, but you've got to think about which is the best for your application and, you know, joining. Okay, so I made some notes. The first thing I'd say is for the written application, there are 4 criteria. So every time you answer, try and refer to each of those 4 criteria, or if you can, or a skill that you learned from each experience. So if they've asked you to talk about jobs, for example, or any extracurricular stuff, try and refer it to the 4 criteria so that each time, it's not all 4, even if you can refer to 1, that really helps because, you know, you're hitting something each time. So what I did was I actually emailed my application to multiple people. So I got my dad to read it first. So it's fine for a non-legal person to read it. But then I emailed it to, I think, 4 or 5 people. And what I did was got everyone's feedback together. And I looked at, you know, everything that they had in common. So if this person said, okay, I liked this, and all 5 of them were agreement, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to keep that. If someone didn't agree with it, I didn't entirely, because you have to remember, like, it's subjective. Some people liked it and some people didn't like it. So at that point, you've got to think, okay, what do you know, you've got to use your own judgment, because there was some circumstances where I got some advice where they're like, okay, well, I think you should take this out. But I actually really like that. So I've kept it on. So you've got to kind of take a bit of a judgment call when it comes to applications. But I emailed it to as many people as I could and took on all of that feedback. I saw one of the questions that Paige put where is the written application as important, you know, even if you're getting an interview? And I 100% think it is, because your written application is the first piece of advocacy, because the bar is not only about your oral advocacy, you've got to also demonstrate that you're a good written advocate. So that's the first time they'll be reading it. And if you've got, you know, if you're saying, oh, I've got attention to detail, but you've got a spelling mistake, or you've got a bit of, you know, like, you've not read it properly, so you've got a bit of a grammatical error, they won't, it's not to say that they'll take it badly, but it's kind of, you're defeating the purpose of, you know, what you've initially said. So your written application is really important. Even if you don't have, like, I had very few, I think I had a couple of, like, I think I did 1 mini when I had applied. So it didn't really matter that I've done 1 mini, as long as my application was flowing and I could demonstrate it in other ways. The other thing was, you've got to keep it very succinct. So when I was applying, I was using a lot of cool words, and I was like, you know what, this word is so cool, I'm going to use it. But actually, you only got 250 words or 200 words in some cases. So most of my feedback said, why are you using this word? Like, what does it even mean? And I really liked that, because during my assignments, I'd use all these cool words, and I said, oh, you know, look how nice this word is, I'm going to use it. But actually, for these scholarship applications, and even when you go on to apply for pupillage, you've got to keep it short and concise, because sometimes it sounds like you're trying to be overly clever. And this is something that I was actually guilty of. So, you know, try and keep it as clear and concise as you can. The other thing was, okay, so I said that already. Don't forget any. Oh yeah, non-legal experience. People think that because you don't have that much legal experience, you can't really talk about it. But actually, had just had a look at my scholarship application, and a lot of the stuff that I spoke about was non-legal. So I, you know, whether it's catering, because I've worked in pretty much all of the industries you can think of. So I spoke about catering, I spoke about retail, I spoke about care, you know, whatever you have, as long as you can demonstrate why it will make you a good barrister, that's what they're looking for. Am I out of time? How much time do I have left, Paige? Is that me done?
No, you're okay. You're okay for a couple more minutes.
Okay, well, that was all my notes that I blasted through.
I have a question for you then, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Was there a question on the application form that you found the most difficult?
Yes. So I thought the ethics question was really difficult. Which was, let me have a quick go to the application now. The ethics question was, so give an example when you've demonstrated integrity or faced an ethical dilemma. I thought that was really difficult. And I was thinking, because in my legal side of, the stuff that I did, there weren't that many ethical dilemmas, at least that I'd faced. So what I used actually was a care home incident where, because I used to work as in a care home, sometimes when people are at an end of life stage and they say, oh, when are your family going to come and see you, for example, you've got to kind of handle it in a certain way. So some people will handle it like, oh, well, they're not coming to see you. And when the way I spoke about it to say that, well, I didn't want to, tell that person that the family's not going to come see them, right? I said it in a sense that I didn't lie to them. I said, look, I'm sure they're thinking about you. So it's a kind of sidestepping that thing where you're not, directly lying to anyone, but you're not also in an ethical situation. So it kind of plays on the morality aspect of things, but I guess they liked it. So, oh, one more thing I was actually going to say was, the more clear the clearer your answers are, the less awkward questions you'll get at interview stage. So sometimes if there's something where you've not been very clear about it, they're going to ask you about those things. So best to be very clear on your application so that you can, most of the stuff that they need to know is on there. So they'll ask you just not softball questions, but questions that you've probably prepared for, and as opposed to questions that you're unprepared for. So
and one last question, so I know Middle Temple is quite unique in that it says, what question would you like us to ask you, or something like that. What question did you put for that?
Yeah, I gave myself a super softball question, and they didn't even ask me the question. So let me have
I was going to ask you that, if they asked it you or not.
No, they didn't ask me. I said I think I said, oh, how did you manage to juggle multiple things at the same time? But they didn't even ask me that question, so I guess it was too much of a softball question. But
yeah, because I know from previous instances that they do sometimes ask. So if somebody's thinking about putting a question on there, make sure you've got an answer for it, just in case.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, can I add one last thing? So for example, the reason why I applied to Middle Temple, because I know they interview everyone, so I didn't think my application looked that good on paper, right? So if you think your A levels were bad, believe me, they weren't bad. Mine were horrendous. So that's why I didn't think that it looked good on paper. So they give you a section that say, provide support of why your application was bad or whatever. You should definitely use that section. So I used it to tell them why my A levels were terrible. And make sure you tell them, you show clearly that you've overcome whatever it was that was a barrier. So yeah, that was definitely something to think about.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We'll now move on to Amrit. So Amrit is a Lincoln's Inn scholar.
Hi all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I received a scholarship from Lincoln's Inn, and I also have gone on to receive another scholarship from UCL. For me, I chose the Inn because I fell in love with the architecture, and I also just loved the history. And also I had been to an event where I found that the Inn was really quite friendly and personable for me, so I really did want to join. But either way, picking an Inn isn't really a big of a deal, I would say. Just pick any, as long as you're comfortable with the application process, also the interviewing process. I think Altimish went through quite a few things on my list, But I would say my top 3 things for success would be, first of all, to remember that your application is a form of advocacy in and of itself. You are trying to persuade people to give you money to fund your bar studies. Second of all, I would say come across as yourself. Don't feel pressured into the need that I need to get more legal experience, or I don't have enough legal experience. All these other experiences that you have had are unique and are special in a way, and they will help your application. For me, I come from a background where I have been working since the age of 14. This has been mostly for children. So I've been doing tutoring, I've been leading sports classes. And I used those skills I had learned. I had to communicate with children. There's a certain skill, I think, that you get when you're communicating with children, because you're having to simplify things to them. And I guess that can be echoed quite a lot in law, where you're having to explain the law to someone who doesn't know anything about the law. So I really tried to use that. My third tip would be, well, my third biggest tip would be just to proofread. You really do want to make sure you don't have any mistakes on your application. So for that, I would say sleep on it. Don't just try and do it all at once. Sleep on it. Do one question at a time. Brainstorm. Then the next day, do the question. Then move on to another question, and just come with every single question, just fresh mindset, a new day. Read it over and over. I think for me, what really helped was actually printing out my answer, highlighting through it, and just reading it out loud. And then again, ask your peers. It doesn't have to be anyone in law. It could be just your friends. I think that that's really, really helpful. And if you're still at uni, definitely use your law careers advisor. I know I used mine at UCL, and that was a lot of help. I think now, just generally with the application process, I've had quite a few questions from people as to where they think in the application certain experiences should go. So for Lincoln's Inn, it's split up in employment, and then it goes to work experiences, and then other experiences. The way that I saw this was, I'm just going to list out all of my employments. I listed every single thing that I have been employed under. I didn't think that, this isn't relevant. Why would I include this? I listed out everything. And then I also listed out work experiences, even if they weren't in the area that I wanted to go into. For example, I did list one with the NHS. I thought, there's still some skills that I've learned from that. It's still useful to put that down. And I even listed some stuff in law, but not what I wanted to go into. The other relevant experience, training and achievements part is where I spoke about my volunteering. So I've had loads of questions asking, where should I put my volunteering? Where should I put the rest of this? Put it all in there. So your volunteering roles. For me, I even wrote about the fact that I had done court visits quite a lot. I didn't have any mini pupillage on my application at the time. So I thought it might be interesting for me to add that. It might be important just to show that I am interested and I am actively seeking out any opportunity I can get. I also wrote down any other scholarships that I'd been awarded based on merit. I had also written down any essay competitions in there, along with any advocacy opportunities that I'd taken part in. So this being mock trials and mooting. I also put down debates that I've been involved in, which I think are quite a good place for that, and also speech competitions, because at the end of the day, that's still a form of advocacy, even though it's not in law. And then I think it's just really, really important, moving on to the additional information for the application, that you remember the criteria, that you have the criteria open in front of you. For me, I did this all in a Word document. So I had the criteria right at the top, and I would tick off when I believe that I'd hit that criteria in that given question, which I think definitely really helped. I think with the intellect, you might feel as though it's not always possible to include in every single question. And yeah, that's true. So don't get yourself too overburdened with having to tick every single box in every single question, as long as you've got it throughout there. And there is a section, of course, at the beginning where you do talk about your educational achievements and your education in general. I think as well, let me just have a look at the next question. I know that there are some people that have come to me saying that they're not quite sure about what areas they do want to practice and how they should frame that or how they should talk about that. For me at the time, I was a bit unsure. I knew I wanted to go into the criminal bar. I was also thinking about the family bar, inquests and inquiries. But when I did have the interview, I was like, right, I know what I want to do now. And I think it's just the point of, you might have more experiences which are going to set you up towards what you do want to do, or give you some more clarity on what you want to do. So don't worry too much about that. I think, again, Altimish was covering about any sort of mitigating circumstances or anything, and whether you should include them or whether you should not. For me, I use this section. I think it's really, really important to use it if you do need to. I would say it's always nice to add a positive spin to the end of it. You don't just want to list out, obviously, reasons why, say, your A-levels weren't quite up to scratch, or list out, you know, financial circumstances or anything. But you do want to put a spin on it. You do want to say, look, I've gone through all this stuff, and regardless, I still remain committed to this, and I'm still heading in that direction. And I think that really helped me. I also had a few questions regarding references. Some people were quite confused as to who they should include. Personally, I used one of my old head teachers from secondary school for one of my references, just because he'd known me for a very long time and I was doing some work, just some volunteering work within the school. So it's always nice to have one that you've known for a very long time, and I sort of saw that as more of a character reference. My second reference was a professor of mine when I was doing my undergraduate, just one that I clicked with, and I felt like I kept in touch with him, so he knew what I was up to and what I was doing. What I would say with your references is just to send them a little overview of what you are applying to, because not all of them will know exactly what an in-scholarship is. So that's really important. Just send them a little synopsis of what you are applying to. Oh, and these are the criteria that I'm trying to hit, so please try and touch on those. I would also say it is useful to then send off your CV to them as well, just so they know what you have been up to if it's been quite a long time. So with my first referee, it obviously been quite a long time. You had obviously heard a few things I was up to, but perhaps not all of them. I think that's mostly it for me, those points. I think Altimish definitely touched on a lot of them for me. But hopefully I've added some sort of other perspective to it as well, and geared mostly towards the application for Lincoln's Inn in particular.
Thank you, Amrit. I just wanted to check, did you use full sentences, or did you use bullet points on your application, or did you use a mixture of the two?
So I used full sentences. Admittedly, what I did do for my employment and sort of work experiences, obviously a bit different with the other section where you get other relevant experiences, training, achievements, etc., because you have a bit more free reign over how much you want to write. I copied and pasted a lot of it from my CV, specifically the work experiences and the employments, just because I felt like I was hitting that STAR criteria. Oh, I don't think any of us have mentioned STAR. I think I should mention STAR. Everyone, please do look up STAR, situation, task, application, result. That's how you want to base your answers. You definitely want to show that you've done something. Yes, this is a task that I was given. This is what I did, and this is what I achieved. I think that that is a really good way of going about it, and that's what I did try to do as much as I could do. And I remember actually being asked in my interview a time where I got a desirable result, I think, maybe in a quite different wording, but I used something essentially from my CV, or just sort of think about those scenarios yourself as to when you have got a desired sort of result from something. And I think it's always good to just think results based. You don't want to just say, oh, I did this, these are the skills that I learned, but also here's the difference I made in that employment, in that work experience, in that volunteering opportunity. So I think that's really, really important to include as well.
Wonderful, thank you. That's very useful. Brilliant. There'll be an opportunity to ask any questions of Amrit towards the end, but I'm going to now move on to Mariam, if that's okay, who is a scholar at Gray's Inn.
Thanks, Paige. And hi, everyone. I am Mariam, preferred pronouns she, her. I'm a bar course student, and I was very lucky last year to get a scholarship from Gray's. As everyone said, there's no better inn. It's all about finding the best environment for you. Unless you chose Gray's, then well done for making the right choice. So a couple of reasons, firstly, why I chose Gray's. To be completely honest, I come from a background where unless I got a scholarship, there was no way I could pay for the bar. So I approached this question really rationally and looked at which scholarship I thought I had a better chance of getting. And here's a couple of reasons as to why I chose Gray's. So firstly, Gray's differs from other inns to the fact that every scholarship they give has a base award of £5,000, which is quite a nice dent into your bar course fees. And that can go up based on financial means testing. But I thought already having £5,000 guaranteed was a really attractive thing to me. And then secondly, Gray's does do a paper sift. So you have to submit a written application, and based on that, some people will or won't be called for interview. Personally, I saw that as a positive thing. I thought that the application form is something that you can control. You can redraft it, you can edit it, you can get other people to look at it. Whereas at the interview, you could be thrown anything and you only have 15 minutes. Whereas with the application form, you can redraft it, you can have a think about it, you can put your best foot forward. And also thinking about it rationally, I was studying law at the time. I thought I was going to be very busy, and I thought if I had to put a lot of time researching, preparing for the interview, I wanted to at least pass the paper sift because there was more of a chance I would get one. Gray's put this publicly last week at their scholarship Q&A, but roughly, if you get to the interview stage, it's 50% of people who get a scholarship. So for me, the paper sift was an advantage, but again, depends on everyone's particular circumstances. But even though I chose my inn based on the rational decision of a scholarship because I needed the funding, I think in hindsight, choosing an inn is a big commitment. It's a lifetime commitment. This is probably where you're going to be for the rest of your life, hopefully. So I think I wish I'd taken the time to look a bit more about that. I'm very lucky. I love the environment of Gray's, but I would advise you not just to look at the financial side of it, even though that's a stark reality, but also to look at the environment you'll be in. Gray's is the smallest inn, which I absolutely love. I've been at the bar, studying the bar for maybe 6 weeks, I think, and already there's so many familiar faces, friendly faces at Gray's. And also the careers team are lovely. Last year I had a panic with a reference and they were on the phone to me. They picked up, so they were really great. And also as we're at the smaller inn, there's also more opportunities around for everyone. It's more likely that you can represent the inn at external competitions, more likely that you can get involved in different qualifying sessions and things like that. So for me, Gray's is the winner for being the small one. So hopefully I've convinced you all to come to Gray's. Before I move on to some of the tips, I just wanted to say that I actually joined this panel last year, obviously as someone viewing it. And I actually found it quite intimidating. And I almost didn't apply. When I was looking at previous scholars, I thought, wow, this all looks insanely incredible. And I almost counted myself out of the process and didn't submit an application, which looking back would have been very silly for me to do. I think it's always worth putting in an application because you never know what might happen. So if you're sat here on this call today and a bit worried about how this all sounds, I would still advise you to put in an application. It's worth a try. And if you're not successful, you've learned something for next year, and if not, for pupillage applications. So I'd really advise you to do that. Right, so on to some of my tips. The first one I would say is, having seen a lot of applications recently, a lot of people tend to make a lot of unsubstantiated claims. And what I mean by that is they might say on their application, I'm a very driven individual, or I know that a life at the bar is for me. And they don't necessarily give any examples as to why that might be. So I would encourage you to any claim that you make to give an example. So for example, I am a driven and committed individual. I've shown this by attending every single committee meeting when I was in the committee of this university society. Or I'm really interested in the bar because I have visited my local court 5 times in the last year. I think sometimes putting those numbers or quantifying things or just giving an example makes your application come across as much more compelling and convincing, rather than saying, the most committed individual you'll ever meet, please choose me. So I think that's really helpful. The second thing I would say is that in some of these applications, I've seen a lot of people be very descriptive. And what I mean by that is when you get a question, let's say, give me an example of when you've shown drive and determination, which is one of the ones at Grays. I've seen people use maybe 100 words of the word count describing the situation. And whilst context is good to give, that won't necessarily pick you up any marks. You'll get the marks by explaining how you showed that drive and determination or how you solved a problem. So when you're looking at answering those questions, what I would advise you to do is in a different color font, maybe put in purple font the things that are describing the context. And then you can see the ratio of how much of your answer is actually just describing things and how much is you actually answering the question. Personally, in my applications, I don't try and describe a situation for more than one sentence, two if it's particularly complicated, and maybe ask friends or other people around you how you can cut down the context. The people reviewing your forms aren't as interested in what moot you did or what the situation was. As long as they have a bit of context as to what it is, they're much more interested in how you approach the situation and what you did. Another thing I wanted to mention was on references. So I would advise you all to contact your referees as soon as possible. Don't leave this to the last minute. I had a problem last year with my referees where I changed in at the last minute and I hadn't told her that I was going to do that, and she was at COP, so she was abroad in a different time zone, and then I was having technical difficulties, and I just caused a really bad impression on my referee by being so disorganized and a lot of unneeded stress for me. So I would recommend you to get the referees sorted as soon as possible, get that submitted, and you don't need to think about it again. And also, you probably want to use them as a referee again, so it's also not the greatest impression. Another thing I would say and advise is when you're talking about stuff about the bar or legal things, try and remain grounded. For example, if you say you definitely want to go to the bar because you love advocacy, at the interview, you might get a question where people say, well, have you considered the negatives of the bar? Are you sure you want to be self-employed? Have you considered how competitive it is? Have you considered the instability of it? So I would be prepared to perhaps be ready to answer those questions. Anything you say in your application that you think is the most unique thing about the bar that you love, be prepared to see the other side of it. Similarly, if you say in your application you want to be a criminal barrister because you want to defend, you want to specialize in murder cases, for example, that's something that juniors will unlikely do. Similarly, for the family bar, be careful about some of the examples you give, because the people on the panel will know exactly what a junior does, what a baby barrister does, and it will come across as if you haven't taken the time to research the profession. So if you're going to give specific examples about professions you want to go into, I'd be wary or be careful that the examples you're giving are things that baby barristers, junior barristers will be doing, and not something that someone will do 20 years into their career. A few more pieces of advice on the merit criteria. I think Amrit and Altamish have already mentioned this, but you're picking up marks by how well you meet the merit criteria. So I try and squeeze in as many examples as you can throughout your application, refer back to it. And I've also seen some people in their applications refer to other merit criteria, things that aren't on there. I think if you've already covered all the merit criteria you're in, it's not a bad thing to do. But similarly, you're probably not going to pick up marks by mentioning something that's not on the merit criteria you're in. So I would personally reuse that word count somewhere else and just stay really targeted at the merit criteria of your in. Another thing on feedback that I saw people in the chat speaking about, if you're sitting here right now and you don't know who you could ask about to put some feedback on your application, I wouldn't worry. I actually didn't have anyone that I could ask in my family or anyone that could probably help me on that. So I actually wrote my written application alone. So it's completely fine to do, and you can get a scholarship without help. But obviously, looking back, I wish I just had the guts to cold message someone on LinkedIn or Twitter. Lots of people are really friendly and they're happy to do that. And being on the other side of it this year, I'm more than happy for people to do that. So I wouldn't worry about not knowing anyone, but equally don't leave yourself at disadvantage. Do message people, reach out to your uni career service. Even if you're alumni, most of the time, they're very happy to hear from people. The last thing I would say is to try and be concise and clear in your application. I think the temptation is sometimes, I think Altamish mentioned this as well, to try and impress and use lots of flowery language. Personally, a tip I got told during law school is make sure your sentence is never longer than 3 lines. If it is, it's probably too long. So try and split your sentence up. try and be clear and reread it as many times as you can and make sure that it's really obvious what you're saying, and actually answer the question in the first sentence if you can. A lot of people sometimes waffle on for too many paragraphs without actually answering the question. So that was a whiz through all the points I wanted to say. I don't know if you have any questions for me, Paige.
Just firstly, I wanted to ask, so something that's different for Lincoln's and Grays is that they have the residential scholarships. Do you know anything about those, especially in relation to Grays?
Yes, I do. So the residential scholarships application, they open up after the Bar Course scholarships. So once you find out if you've got a Bar Course scholarship or you haven't, sadly, the applications for the residential scholarship will then open up. So that is the second stage of the process. You don't need to worry about that right now, but it's definitely good to keep in mind. You'll then send off an application and then have an interview. And the focus of it is really, they're looking to see how much you would give back to Grays if you're given this opportunity. Would you get involved in the life of the inn? Have you shown examples at school or at uni when you've done that before? And secondly, what you would get out of this opportunity. So for example, are you someone who doesn't live in London, who maybe without this opportunity, you wouldn't get to go to pupillage, open evenings, you wouldn't be able to do as many minis. So they're looking at that two-way process, what you could give to the inn, but also why they should give this great opportunity to you and what you'd make the most out of it.
Brilliant. And was there a question on the Grays Inn application that you found difficult?
Yeah, so there's a question, I think it's on there again this year. It's about lateral thinking. So it asks you for a time, give an example of the time you've used lateral thinking, creativity, and judgment. The word lateral thinking really put me off. I didn't really know what it meant, but I think it basically means just something you've done that's outside of the box. And I think that's hard to explain because I think it's really easy in that answer to talk about a problem you've solved, where actually they're looking at creativity, they're looking at lateral judgment. So when you're answering that question, I would advise people to look at what you did that was something new. And it doesn't have to be anything wildly exciting. Maybe you're on the committee of a university society and you decided to put on this new event because you thought it'd be really helpful for anyone. I think that's a good way of answering it. So I would just encourage people to focus on what the creative aspect was, what the new aspect of it was, rather than the tempting thing to just answer a usual problem-solving question.
Brilliant. And just one last question. I know that there's been a lot of talk in the chat box, and it's something that people worry about generally, and that's the people having lack of legal experience. In your application, did you have examples of non-legal experience put forward as well as legal experience?
Absolutely. The majority of my application was non-legal experience. And actually seeing some of the applications coming in, I think it's much more interesting to read an answer about something that's not your classic, I did a moot, this is what I did, or I did a mini. It comes across much more interesting to have people draw on other experiences. It makes your application much more unique. And also I think it's almost, I wouldn't say better, but almost if you've done a part-time job for maybe 5-6 years, I think the experiences you can draw from that are probably have greater depth than being on a committee society. So I wouldn't worry about that. I think having some real life experience can be looked upon very favorably, I think that's the word, by panels. So I wouldn't worry about that. I think it makes your application stand out. But equally, if you don't have any non-legal experience, that's also fine. It shows you're committed. I think at the end of the day, the panel are less interested about the example you give. They're more interested in how you can explain what you did, what you learned from it. So I would focus less on what it actually is, but more how you can pull out as many relevant skills and experiences from that.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So last but not least, we'll move on to Emily, and she is a scholar at Inner Temple.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming along this evening. As Paige has so wonderfully introduced me, my name is Emily. I am a pupil barrister at the moment, and I received a scholarship from Inner Temple for the 2022-23 bar course intake, so that was last year. And then I received several scholarships from my chosen bar course provider as well. So I was in a very fortunate position. I think essentially everyone's covered so many things today, so I'm not going to talk at you for too long because you've all sat so wonderfully and listened to everyone say their piece. But there's just a few points that I would quite like to raise that I think have sort of popped up over the evening, and some things from my own experience. So the first one I would like to discuss quite briefly with you is the legal work experience. Now, every application that I've ever read, people have always said to me, I don't think I've got enough legal work experience. Why should I apply? Should I have more legal work experience, etc., etc.? My answer is absolutely not. I didn't have a single piece of legal work experience before getting either scholarships or pupillage. It is absolutely not something that is 100% necessary for you to be able to succeed at the bar. In fact, I go so far sometimes to tell people that they need to stop putting legal work experience down, because I've read people's applications and they've put down 10 or 15 mini pupillages and nothing else. Please, please don't do that. The golden number, or so I've been told, sorry if you can hear my dog causing some drama in the background, the golden number for me that I've heard is between 3 and 5 mini pupillages. They don't want to know that you've done 17,000. They want to know what you've learned from 3. And my advice for individuals that have lots and lots of mini pupillages is that choose a couple from your chosen practice area that you're telling people on the form, and choose one from an area that's slightly different. You know, you can say, I did 2 mini pupillages in criminal law and I did 1 in family law. That 1 in family law made me realise how much I loved criminal law. And I think that's a really great way to show that you've A, done your research, and B, you're really committed to this career and you'll know what you're going into. Baxter, if you don't stop, we're going to have a falling out. I'm busy. So he's been with me through the bar course. I think he might as well be on the panel as well. So Vishen, that's a really great question, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. The experience I had was all with people. So I had experience, I've worked with children with special needs for a lot of years now, too many years, and if I told you, you'd figure out my age. And the young people that I've worked with are what has made me go into this job, because the individuals I've worked with personally, a lot of them have had varying levels of autism. Most of them have communicated in a way other than with words, so whether that be through noises or that could be through sign language. And I think that what the bar is looking for now is moving away from what it used to look for all of those years ago. So from my experiences so far doing the bar course in the last sort of month of pupillage, is that the bar now is looking for human beings that can talk to human beings. The kind of people that they want coming up into the profession are individuals that can talk to people from all sorts of backgrounds without any bias or prejudice. And I think that if you're able to demonstrate that on your application, then you're one step ahead, because having all of this legal work experience and mooting experience is great, but it's not real life. And we are working with people in real life who are facing some of the worst times, especially in crime and family, some of the worst times in their life at that point, whether they be witness or defendant. So that's my bit on legal work experience. I'll now move on to the actual application form for INA, if that's okay with everybody. So INA, I think that their application form sounds slightly easier than that of Gray's and Lincoln's on the kind of questions that are being asked. So I've just opened my application from too many years ago now, and it's only 2 years old. And I think that the hardest question I've ever been asked in interviews is, why do you want to be a barrister? And I think that this is the hardest question out of all of the questions they could ask you, because it's actually asking you multiple questions in one. So the question, why do you want to be a barrister, is asking you, why have you chosen this in? Why do you want to be a barrister here? Or at whatever chambers if it's a pupillage application. It's asking you to demonstrate your long-term commitment to the career, because it doesn't want to know that you found it yesterday. It wants to know that you've been looking at this career for a long time and you're passionate about it. And it's also asking you a really, really loaded question and only giving you like 200 words to answer it, which is absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things when you realise all of the things you want to hit. So I think that the best way to answer this question, and the way that I answered this question, is in a way that conveys your passion for the career without being a life story. So don't bother putting in about all your work experience in this question, because there are other questions that are relevant for those experiences. In this question, I said that I want to help people, basically, in obviously a much more flowery way than that, and that my passion comes from communication and fairness and justice, and I tied that into my personal experiences and my work experiences. So I think that it's more about your passion than it is your skills and your background, that question. So moving on to the next one that is on the application form, it was your skills, and it asks you in a very general sense what skills you have. The best way that I think you can answer this question is by looking at the criteria and taking exactly from the criteria what the inn you're applying for is looking for, applying to is looking for, and give it a reason as to why you've got that skill. And I think I did this in a more bullet point format. So I took the skill that they're looking for, i.e. leadership, and I said, this is where I demonstrated leadership. You know, school council, head of a club, whatever you've got. And then I did that for all of the different skills that, or the different criteria that INA were looking for. And I think that that's a really good way of being able to get all of the skills onto your application form in quite a short and succinct way, whilst making sure you're hitting all of those points that they want you to hit. So, and I'm seeing questions pop in. I will try and come back to them at the end, but if I lose my flow, then that's it. So the next question for INA was provide details of your intended plans for pupillage. This was on my application form. I think, again, this is one of those questions that's asking more than what the question is saying, because I think this question is asking you to demonstrate that A, you know what pupillage is and you've researched that. B, you have an understanding of how competitive pupillage can be to get, because I think the inns don't want people going in with a false idea that they will finish and then they will go straight onto pupillage, which is what some people can think. And I think this is where you talk about where your interest where your spark has come from all those years ago when you fell in love with the career and the profession. Why did that happen? So for me, it was a criminal law case I was really interested in for a long time, back when I was around 12. And it was then meeting a barrister in a Crown Court with a young person, and he pulled a wand out of his robe and said, "Don't worry, Harry Potter sent me," to the young person who was on a court familiarization visit. And I thought to myself, I could do that. I could be that person that cheers someone up when they're in the worst minute of their life, about to give evidence to a courtroom. And those were the two things for me that went hand in hand that gave me this profession. So I think that question is where you can show a little bit of your personality and show a little bit of your sort of sparkle and joy and a little bit of humanity. I think is a really good place to get that into your application. And then it went on to the advocacy experience, which I think has been well covered by the other panelists here tonight. Again, this is one of those situations where don't just put "I mooted" or "I did the mock trial." Put something along the lines of "I mooted, this is what I learned," or "I competed in the mock trial, I really enjoyed it, that has made me go on to X, Y, and Z, and this is what I've learned from that." Again, doesn't have to be legal work experience. Mine was appropriate adulting in custody suites as a volunteer, and when I was part of the Air Cadets when I was younger. So I think please make sure that you don't write off those things that you think seem really silly and seem laughable, like the Air Cadets, because they're really important work experiences that you've had. The last question on this application form was respecting differences in opinions. Now, this is something that as a barrister you will do every single day, because the whole point of the law is that one person thinks they're right and the other person thinks they're right. So we need 12 people to decide who's right and a judge to make sure that those 12 people have decided right. So I think that this question is probably one of the most important ones to get right. I started off by saying that lots and lots of things come to mind, which paints me as a very argumentative individual, and I think avoid that at all costs. What I did end up putting down was an experience I'd had in a police interview. And Paige, I'm sure you're very familiar with overzealous police officers who love to go at children for 45 minutes over really petty offences. And this was something that I'd put down because, on the one hand, the police officer is right. This young person has been arrested for a criminal offence, is over the age of 10, and should take responsibility for those actions. On the other hand, that's a young person who needs to be treated the same way an adult would be treated, regardless of the fact that the police officer might really dislike them or they've been arrested 17,000 times before. That doesn't matter. So my opinion was that that young person deserved to be treated properly and questioned appropriately. Stop it. And questioned appropriately. Whereas the police officer really wanted to get to the bottom of this case. That was a time that I had explained, again, much more succinctly than that on the application form. And I think that being able to really dive into the fact that you had to respect a difference of opinion in that question is the most important thing. And in this instance, I would avoid talking about things like the customer wanted to pay £1.50 for their drink, but the price was £2, because that's not necessarily a difference of opinion. That's a difference of fact. So really try and think for this one, whether or not you did some group work at university and one person was really into it and the rest of your group wasn't, that would be more of an appropriate answer, I think, for that kind of question than the work experience we were talking about earlier. The other question I was asked, and not on the application form, was, and I only bring this up because I think it was you, Mariam, that mentioned about what you would do without a scholarship. I was actually asked this question later on in the process, and I think I wasn't pre-warned about this. So I think you guys, I've got the ability now to be able to say something to you. And the question was, what would you do if you don't get the scholarship? And I think that this is a really harsh question to ask, because there are lots of people out there, myself included, that if I didn't get the scholarship, I wouldn't have been able to do the bar course, or I would have really struggled to have done the bar course. So I think that question is slightly unfair, but the worst thing to do in that question is say, I wouldn't do it, because what they're really testing here is your commitment to the profession. And if you are committed to the profession, you will do something in order to make sure you can do that job. So I wanted to raise that because I thought that was quite a tough question to be asked and to answer. But in terms of sort of quick fire advice, proofread, like everybody said, because that is so important. Have a structure, have a really good structure to your answers, whether it's the STAR method or a method that you prefer and have used previously. The most important thing to remember about the application form itself is that application form is their first impression of you. That application form is a piece of written advocacy, and it is the first thing that they're going to see with your name on. So please make sure that there is a structure, that it is proofread, that it is grammatically correct, that it's not got all of these fancy flavoury words that all of the people think that barristers use. We really don't. So I think that those would be my biggest tips in terms of the paper application. I don't know if you have any more questions for me, Paige. I appreciate that was a really quick run through.
No, I think you've pretty much covered everything. Just one thing that I wanted to ask you. Sometimes people think when they've applied to inner and middle that it doesn't really matter what's on the application form because I'm going to shine in the interview and it's all going to work out just fine there. Did you have time in your interview to cover all of the things that you'd put in your application, or was the interview in addition to your application?
The interview was completely different from my application. The questions that I was asked on my application, I wasn't asked again in the interview. My answers stood as they were. In fact, the interview, without going into too much detail, I appreciate this is about the written application. The interview was very much based on advocacy skills. So there was a couple of argue for and against, rather than questions about me. And the questions that were about me were kind of broadly intertwined in advocacy activities. So there was a question about the cab rank rule that then came into a question about me and whether I would stand for my principles and that kind of thing. But no, the application stood by itself.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that Altamish just had a couple of more things to add, and then we'll go over to answering questions.
Hi, yeah, I was just listening to the answers, and I just took down a couple of bullet points that I think are definitely something to keep in mind. Because I was also watching last year on this panel, which is why I said, look, it's my turn to kind of give something. So some people, and this is not me discouraging you, but even last year when some people were on the panel, they said that they'd applied for the second time and the third time when they'd got it. So don't let that discourage you, in the sense that you've got to understand that your CV only gets better. So I know of someone in middle who applied, I won't say which inn, but they applied twice to a different inn and then applied to middle and got it. But by the time they'd applied to that middle scholarship, their CV now is really good. So your CV only marinates over time. So don't let it discourage you into, I haven't got it this time. But because that will actually translate to when you're applying for pupilages as well. Your CV will be a lot better than different, people who have just come out fresh, graduated with no experience. So don't let it hold you back. And the other thing was, when you go into your interview, go in there. This was what someone told me. Go in there knowing that you deserve that scholarship. Because actually, if you are kind of thinking that, oh, do I deserve it? Am I good enough? You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot even before you've begun. One more thing was maintain your relationships with your referees. I'm telling you, they will be really useful throughout your career, whether it's at the bar, whether it's you're applying to, pupilages, applications, like they will stand by you. So maintain your relationships. And the last thing was, some people think that when they answer the why do you want to be a barrister question, it has to be like, oh, it's like some kind of childhood dream where, you woke up one night and you automatically knew that you wanted to be a barrister. That's not the case. Like for me, for example, I didn't know I always wanted to be a barrister, but because I'd worked at a solicitor's firm and I've kind of approached it in a more logical sense that, look, I've done this job, but I've also seen this side of it and I prefer that side of it. So that was my few little things that I wanted to get out there before, we went into questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There's just one reoccurring question that's been through the chat, and I'm just going to clarify that just before we go on to the questions. You can only apply to one inn per year. Okay, if you become a member of an inn this year, you are kind of stuck with that inn. I know that sometimes in very rare circumstances you can move to a different inn, but that is very rare, and I think there has to be a good reason for it. So that's why I said at the start, do not join. If you're unsure, do not join an inn until after you know whether or not you've got a scholarship. Because if you then want to change your mind and go to a different inn next year, that option is obviously available to you. I just wanted to clarify that because I'm not sure if it wasn't clear in the messages. There's been one question that's about international experience and somebody that's got experience in Australia and Hong Kong, and they're asking whether or not that's important and whether it should be on the application. What are your views on that, Emily? I can see you nodding your head.
My experience was in the USA, and it was the thing that I was asked about the most. I worked on a summer camp in America for 5 years, and I don't think that it makes any difference where your experience was, because it's what you learn during that experience that is the important thing for the interviews and for the inns. And in terms of legal work experience, obviously mine wasn't legal, but again, same rules apply. It's about what you learn, not where or what your experience necessarily was.
Yeah, definitely agree. A lot of my experience was actually international, Australia, America, India, and that makes you interesting. It makes you stand out from other people. So definitely put it on there. There is a further question about mitigating circumstances, and that just prompted me to think about, in COVID, a lot of people were putting on their forms, oh, COVID has impacted the work experience I've been able to get, and that's why I've not got as many mini pupilages, etc., as other people. Obviously, we're now moving on from the pandemic, and I'm sure that there are still some knock-on effects of that. But mitigating circumstances, Mariam, what sort of things do you think should be going in that box? Do you think the pandemic should still be going in that box at this stage?
I think if the pandemic impacted you, perhaps you had a bereavement, someone passed away in the middle of exams, perhaps you're still suffering with long COVID, you've got a health complication, I think it's definitely something you should be putting down. But I think if you're saying the pandemic is why you can't get work experience, I would be prepared to be questioned by that on the panel. And they might say, we've had 10 applicants before you, they've managed to find experience, why haven't you? My approach to mitigating circumstances is I think it's always worth to put it down. If they don't know about it, they can't take it into consideration. But at the same time, maybe sense check it with a few other people. I think there are people out there who genuinely have mitigating circumstances, and it's very important that's taken into account. But at the same time, there's sometimes people who puts things down that perhaps with better judgment wouldn't be. This is me quoting someone at the Grays Q&As with someone, not me, but said perhaps they've seen someone say, I ranked 3rd at Oxford instead of 1st because of a mitigating circumstance that perhaps wasn't a mitigating circumstance. So maybe sense check what you want to put down with other people, because in your application, you also want to show sound judgment, and perhaps not using that box for what it should be used, perhaps isn't showing sound judgment. But overall, if you don't put it down, they don't know about it. So my advice would be put it down with a bit of sense.
That just reminded me of something as well. I once saw an application, and in the extenuating circumstances box, it said that I didn't get 85% on my dissertation for X reason, and the mitigating circumstances was not, a terrible mitigating circumstance. But what I would say is you're then going to interview against panelists that probably got 75% and felt really brilliant and thought that they'd done really well. And you saying I didn't get 85%. Is kind of talking down to what they got. So just be wary if you've got a decent grade and you're saying, oh, I didn't get 85% for X reason. Just think about the people that are going to be sat on the panel opposite you, because you don't want to offend anybody and come across or get on the wrong foot before you've even started. So yeah, that just made me think about that with you saying the thing about the person from Oxford. Brilliant. Okay, and that's kind of sparked a little bit of a debate about mitigating circumstances, so I'll leave that there. There was somebody that was asking why would a person want to change INS, and I think they're trying to get a bit of scope about the flaws of the INS. So I know that you're all here to say great things about your INS, but is there anything at all that you can think of since you've been a member of the Inn that might make you think, oh, should I maybe I would have gone to Middle if I had my time again, or wherever it might be? Go on, Emily.
I love Inner. Let me preface this by saying that I do love my Inn. However, I am someone on circuit, which means that I am based outside of London. So for those of you based outside of London, I know that Middle, as it pains me to say it, but Middle are really, really good for circuit students and for circuit barristers. And that's because they do things like qualifying sessions, which is part of your bar course year, on circuit in person. And I think that's something that I have missed out on slightly being with Inner, is that they don't run, well, I've not come across any in the last 2 years, any events based outside of London. And I think that is a little bit of a shame. And I've fed this back to Inner as well, so this isn't a secret, but I think it would be good if they did some things more circuit based.
I think that's a problem with the Inns generally, isn't it? Amrit, what about you? What about is there anything about Lincoln's Inn that you would change, or anything like?
In all honesty, I haven't encountered anything. I think I've just enjoyed my time there so far, and I've just enjoyed going to any events that I can go to, just even outside of the qualifying sessions. And I'm just really happy there. I think I got like there we go, everyone go off to Lincoln's. I haven't got any qualms. I think, again, I'm from London, I live in London, it's on the Piccadilly line for me, so I can get there by South Western Rail as well. So there's nothing for me. I think I'm really enjoying it. And again, like location, I think that that's a thing for a lot of people as well, and definitely something to bear in mind. But yeah.
What about you, Altamish? You're on mute.
My bad. I was going to say, we've got the Midland Circuit dinner coming up for Middle Temple. If anybody is going to come to that, I shall see you there. But yeah, I really like Middle. I've personally, the only one thing that not that I don't like it, but it's a little thing, but I think Inner Temple's library is really good. That being said, when I go to Middle Temple Library, it feels like a home. I get a homely feeling, which I don't get in the Inner Temple Library. Although the actual library setup is way better, I have to admit. But apart from that, Middle Temple is on point.
And Mariam, what about you? I know you was saying that Gray's Inn is brilliant earlier on, so you might not say anything bad, but
In all honesty, I love Gray's. The library's always quiet, which is good. So there's always a space. I'm not going to name them, but other inns, if you're at the ICCA bar course, you can't access the materials at other inns. So that's another brownie point for Gray's. Another thing that people might not know is the location of the inns. So Lincoln's and Gray's are a bit closer to each other, and then Inner and Middle Temple ones are closer to each other. I found out recently that Gray's is the closest one to BPP, to be going to that uni with the closest in.
brilliant. And there was just a question that was, what was an important thing that an inn had to offer when you was looking to apply, or is it more important to see which will fit your application more? Amrit, what do you think about that?
I think for me, I sort of thought it doesn't matter what inn I join. I've just got to see if I have that personal connection with it, if I feel like I'm going to fit into that community. And I just felt like I would with Lincoln, so I joined there. And again, like I said, I appreciate the architecture. I also just really like, again, the location of it is quite easy for me. I've got 2 different ways of getting to it if there's any strikes. And yeah, no, I didn't really think of anything in particular. I think as well the history of the inn really resonated with me, and that was another reason why I chose it. But again, I think it's just down to personal preference. I don't think it's a choice that you should stress over too much. Or perhaps if you do want to take it as a choice, and you want to think about it quite a lot, look at all the applications. Think about which application that you think that you will do better on, which one you believe that perhaps you have some experience in writing certain answers, anything that is similar to that. That's all. I think for me, again, a bit of the application, but for me, it was just, I just want to pick it. I didn't really spend too much time thinking about it. I just did it.
Brilliant. Okay, just before I wrap up, there's a question from Taylor that says, would anyone say that your geographical location would influence your choice of inn? I think Emily hit the nail on the head in that if you're from London, the inns are obviously based in London, so it's going to be easier for you to access them. I'm based in Nottingham. I know that Emily is based on Circuit, and you either have to travel down to London for the qualifying sessions. Generally speaking, they'll do the odd one on Circuit, like Middle Temple, but they don't do them all on Circuit. So I think that the reality is that you are going to have to travel down to the inn if you want to make the most of it. Sorry, Altamish is based in Leicester as well. So quite a broad spectrum of us, but I think you just have to think logically. They are based in London, so at some point you're going to have to go there. And they don't have sub inns around the country, which is unfortunately the reality of the bar. A lot of things are based in London, and the best work experience is often in London, unfortunately. So yeah, I'm sure you're all very much aware of the situation with that. Brilliant. So I'm just going to wrap up there then, because I'm aware that we have overrun. Thank you, all of you, for attending, and thank you to the 4 panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us and answer everybody's questions. I'm sure that it's been very useful, and I know that a lot of people do find this sort of thing very helpful, particularly when they've not got access to other people to answer their questions as well. Just to finish off, I would say that no matter what background you come from, you can and will probably get a scholarship. You know, people on this panel are from all walks of life, and all of us have managed to get scholarships. So give it a go. if you at first you don't succeed, then you can always try again next year. And if you have any questions at all, I'm more than happy to answer, as I'm sure the scholars are also happy to answer as well. And you can connect with them on LinkedIn and ask them questions, but please don't bombard them too much because I'm sure they're all very busy. Thank you all, and I'll pop the recording up as soon as I can for those that joined a little bit later.